My friends, colleagues, and truth seekers, today we find ourselves standing at a crossroads of history. The skies over the Middle East, once filled with the cries of hope and despair, now tremble with the roar of confrontation. A Yemeni airdrop, an event seemingly tactical, perhaps even symbolic, has erupted into what many are calling the deadliest confrontation yet with Israel. But beneath the clouds of smoke and the noise of warplanes lies something far more profound, an economic, political, and moral reckoning for our modern world. The Yemeni defiance that erupted through a bold airdrop represents far more than a tactical move. It is a historic inflection point in the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. For years, Yemen has stood as a silent witness to devastation, suffocated by a relentless blockade, famine, and foreign intervention. Yet in that silence brewed something powerful, the will to resist. This recent airdrop is not merely a show of force, it is a declaration, a message written across the skies that Yemen refuses to be invisible any longer. What makes this moment so striking is not just the act itself, but the symbolism it carries. A nation long portrayed as weakened, fractured, and dependent has asserted its agency in the most defiant way possible by striking at the heart of the regional order that has kept it subjugated for decades. The world expected Yemen to crumble. Instead, it rose from the ruins, turning despair into defiance. This single act exposes the limits of power and the resilience of those who have nothing left to lose. The skies that once rained bombs upon Yemeni cities now carry the echoes of their response, a signal to the world that even the smallest nations can disrupt the mightiest players when pushed to the edge. But beneath the roar of engines and the precision of drones lies something deeper, the accumulated anger of generations denied sovereignty and dignity. For years, Yemen has been treated not as a nation, but as a battlefield, a proxy arena where global powers wage invisible wars for dominance. The airdrop punctured not only the airspace, but also the illusion that Yemen is merely a passive victim. It forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. Desperation breeds defiance, and defiance, when forged in survival, is unstoppable. The message reverberates beyond Yemen's borders. It challenges a regional hierarchy that has thrived on the silence of the oppressed and the complacency of the powerful. For Israel, the confrontation is a stark reminder that even distant wars can ignite fires closer to home. For the Western powers backing these dynamics, it signals a dangerous shift, a realignment of resistance across the Middle East that no longer obeys the traditional boundaries of diplomacy or deterrence. This is no longer a struggle confined to territory. It is ideological, economic, and profoundly human. In many ways, this act of defiance has rewritten Yemen's narrative on the global stage. No longer just a humanitarian crisis buried beneath statistics, Yemen now stands as a symbol of resilience against imperial structures that exploit vulnerability. It represents the awakening of a nation that refuses to be erased from history by the politics of power. The airdrop's significance lies not in its immediate military impact, but in the psychological tremor it has sent across the region. It tells the world that the oppressed have found their voice, and it roars louder than ever before. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of this moment is its unpredictability. No one saw Yemen coming, not like this, not now. And that unpredictability is precisely what shakes the foundations of dominance. When those who are expected to submit instead rise to challenge, when those written off by history decide to rewrite it, the balance of power begins to shift. The Yemeni airdrop is that shift, a reminder that even in the shadow of destruction, courage can soar higher than fear, and resistance can pierce the sky. Behind every explosion that lights up the Middle Eastern night sky, behind every missile that streaks across the horizon, there lies a powerful and often unseen force, the economic engine of war. It is the quiet hum beneath the chaos, the machinery that converts suffering into profit and destruction into data points on an investor's chart. War, as uncomfortable as it may sound, is not merely a geopolitical contest. It is a business model. Every bomb dropped, every weapon sold, every reconstruction contract signed. These are not random acts of defense or diplomacy. They are transactions, investments in a global market that thrives on conflict and instability. The Yemeni airdrop and the subsequent confrontation with Israel are only the latest chapters in a much older economic story. Wars do not erupt in a vacuum. They are sustained, expanded, and sometimes even manufactured by financial incentives. For decades, defense industries across the world have built fortunes not on peace, but on the perpetual anticipation of war. The more unstable a region becomes, the more valuable its destruction appears to those who profit from rebuilding it. When conflict breaks out, stock prices of arms manufacturers surge, energy markets tighten, and global investors circle like hawks. What we see on television as chaos, others see as opportunity. This dynamic is not confined to one country or ideology. It is systemic. The global capitalist framework rewards those who can turn crises into cash flow. Governments allocate billions to military spending while cutting budgets for education, healthcare, and poverty relief. Private corporations secure contracts to supply weapons, logistics, and technology, often funded by the very taxpayers who will later bear the cost of post-war reconstruction. The victims of war pay twice, first with their lives and then with their labor, rebuilding what profit-driven destruction has torn apart. Professor Richard Wolff often reminds us that capitalism's most dangerous talent is its ability to monetize anything, even human misery. In this light, war becomes a predictable outcome of economic design. The confrontation between Yemen and Israel, though political on the surface, sits atop a foundation of industrial demand and economic dependency. Every drone strike fuels the production line. Every military escalation boosts corporate revenue. The rhetoric of national security, sovereignty, and defense often masks what is, at its core, a system of profit extraction from global instability. Meanwhile, the media, often funded by advertisers with stakes in these industries, plays its role in maintaining the illusion. Coverage focuses on strategy and spectacle, never on the money trail. Rarely do we hear of the billions in contracts exchanged behind closed doors or the speculative trading that follows every outbreak of violence. The narrative of defense replaces the reality of demand, and so the war machine keeps turning, greased by the currency of fear and fueled by the myth of necessity. It is this hidden economy that ensures wars never truly end. They only evolve. The Yemeni airdrop is a spark, but the fire burns because powerful interests ensure it never goes out completely. For them, peace is not profitable. The longer the tension lasts, the richer the returns. Beneath every headline of conflict lies an invisible ledger, where lives lost are numbers, and destruction is measured not in sorrow, but in shares. The hidden economic engine of war is not a metaphor. It is a reality, humming relentlessly beneath the noise of the battlefield, turning blood into balance sheets and chaos into capital. In every conflict, the first casualty is not always the soldier, it is the truth. The battle for public perception begins long before the first missile is launched, and the media becomes the battlefield where reality is reshaped, reframed, and repackaged for consumption. When we look at how the Yemeni airdrop and Israel's response have been portrayed globally, a clear pattern emerges. The story is told not as it is, but as it serves those in power. What we witness is not journalism, it is narrative management. The headlines speak of aggression, retaliation, and security threats, yet they remain silent about the years of siege, starvation, and political suffocation that led to this moment. This selective storytelling is no accident. Media outlets, particularly those in the West, operate within a framework that reflects the interests of the political and corporate powers that fund them. The conflict is not just reported, it is curated. Each word, each image, each headline is designed to evoke a specific emotional response, one that aligns with existing geopolitical agendas. Yemen becomes a footnote, Israel becomes the protagonist, and the broader context of economic exploitation and foreign interference fades into obscurity. The suffering of millions is compressed into seconds of footage, stripped of history, and served as spectacle to a distracted world. The deeper problem lies in how the media constructs moral hierarchies of violence. When powerful nations act, it is called defense. When weaker ones resist, it is labeled terrorism. This distortion shapes public opinion and ultimately policy. The result is a global audience conditioned to empathize selectively, to weep for some victims while ignoring others. The tragedy of Yemen, for instance, has rarely been framed as the humanitarian catastrophe it truly is. Instead, it is presented as a peripheral crisis, distant and complex, unworthy of sustained outrage. Yet when the same conflict spills over into Israeli airspace, the narrative shifts instantly, urgency returns, and the cycle of moral prioritization continues. Professor Richard Wolff has often pointed out that media is not merely a reflection of society, it is one of its most powerful economic instruments. In capitalist systems, where information itself is a commodity, truth becomes negotiable. Media conglomerates are owned by the same corporate interests that profit from war, trade, and energy. When these interests intersect, impartiality becomes impossible. The stories we receive are not intended to inform. They are designed to maintain order, to protect investments, and to preserve the illusion of legitimacy around state violence. The greatest power of the media lies not in what it tells us, but in what it chooses to omit. It can make an entire people invisible by simply refusing to name them. It can transform an act of resistance into an act of aggression by altering a single headline. It can reduce decades of oppression into a flare-up and justify destruction as necessary measures. The media, in its polished objectivity, has become the most sophisticated weapon of modern warfare, not through lies, but through half-truths that shape perception while obscuring accountability. In the case of Yemen, this distortion has been catastrophic. The blockade, the famine, the humanitarian collapse all fade into background noise while the latest confrontation dominates the screen. The narrative is rewritten daily, each version erasing a little more of the truth. And as audiences consume these filtered realities, the real victims remain voiceless, their stories buried beneath the headlines crafted to sustain the powerful. The media may not drop bombs, but it builds the silence that allows them to fall unchecked. Israel's response to the Yemeni airdrop did not merely reflect a military reaction, it symbolized the reassertion of a familiar cycle of power that has long defined the geopolitics of the Middle East. The speed, scale, and precision of Israel's retaliation were not surprising. They were predictable, almost rehearsed. Yet beneath the layers of strategy and rhetoric lies a deeper reality. This confrontation is not about a single incident, but about maintaining a system where dominance is preserved through force and resistance is crushed before it dares to grow roots. The cycle of power in this region is not accidental. It is engineered, reinforced through alliances, and perpetuated by the economic and political interests that sustain it. What makes Israel's response particularly significant is the way it exposes the asymmetry of the conflict. On one side stands a state backed by cutting edge weaponry, global intelligence networks, and unwavering Western support. On the other, a nation ravaged by years of war and deprivation, struggling merely to survive. When Yemen's defiance pierced the airspace of Israeli control, it challenged not just a military boundary, but a psychological one. It questioned the long-standing assumption that power flows only one way, that certain nations are entitled to act with impunity while others must endure in silence. Israel's reaction, therefore, was not simply defensive, it was existential. It sought to reestablish that imbalance, to remind the region who holds the monopoly on force and legitimacy. This pattern is not new. Throughout modern history, Israel's military doctrine has been built upon the principle of deterrence through overwhelming retaliation. Every strike, every bombardment carries with it a message intended for all potential adversaries. Resistance will be met with devastation. Yet, as Professor Richard Wolff has often emphasized, the paradox of power is that the more it is used to enforce submission, the weaker it becomes morally and politically. Each show of strength reveals the fear behind it, the fear of losing control, of facing a shifting order in which the oppressed begin to rewrite the terms of engagement. The Yemeni airdrop, though limited in scope, pierced that illusion of absolute dominance and forced a global audience to reconsider the balance of power that underpins this conflict. What is often overlooked in the discourse surrounding Israel's response is the economic machinery that sustains it. Military operations are not isolated decisions, they are the continuation of political economies that depend on defense spending, foreign aid, and arms trade. Every strike authorizes another contract. Every escalation justifies more investment in technology and surveillance. The cycle of power thus becomes a cycle of profit. Violence becomes both a means of control and a source of economic vitality. When Israel launches airstrikes, it is not only asserting security, it is reinforcing a global system in which might is monetized and morality is negotiable. And yet, even as the bombs fall, a different truth emerges. Power enforced through fear is never permanent. Each act of domination plants the seeds of future resistance. The more a nation relies on coercion, the more fragile its legitimacy becomes in the eyes of the world. Yemen's defiance, in that sense, struck deeper than any weapon. It targeted the very narrative of invincibility that Israel has long projected. What unfolded in the skies was more than a military confrontation. It was a moment of symbolic inversion, a glimpse of what happens when the powerless refuse to remain powerless. The cycle of power, for all its brutality, may be entering a new and unpredictable phase, one in which the language of strength is no longer the only one spoken. The confrontation ignited by the Yemeni airdrop has done more than expose geopolitical tensions. It has peeled back the veneer of morality that capitalism so carefully wears. Beneath the rhetoric of national interest, global security, and humanitarian concern lies a brutal truth. Our world's economic system thrives on the very instability it claims to oppose. The morality of modern capitalism, when tested against the backdrop of war, collapses into contradiction. We live in an era where destruction generates dividends and the suffering of nations becomes an entry in a profit ledger. The Yemeni-Israeli crisis is not just a clash of states, it is a mirror held up to a global system that rewards exploitation, commodifies conflict, and sells empathy to the highest bidder. Every explosion that lights up the Middle Eastern night sky reverberates across stock exchanges thousands of miles away. The markets respond before the diplomats do. Oil prices fluctuate, defense stocks rise, and investors position themselves to profit from tragedy. This is not coincidence, it is design. The machinery of capitalism has no allegiance to peace. It moves where the profit flows. When nations burn, economies churn. In the polished offices of defense contractors and multinational corporations, war is not seen as catastrophe but as opportunity. Reconstruction contracts, weapons deals, and security consultancies turn bloodshed into balance sheets. The moral outrage that echoes through speeches and press releases is drowned by the hum of financial transactions that depend on war continuing just long enough to remain lucrative. Professor Richard Wolff has long argued that capitalism's deepest flaw is its capacity to detach morality from consequence. It can make killing profitable, inequality justifiable, and exploitation invisible. In the case of Yemen and Israel, this detachment is glaring. Western governments that supply weapons to both sides of the regional conflict stand before the cameras as advocates of peace. Financial institutions fund reconstruction with the same fervor with which they finance destruction. The system feeds on both chaos and recovery, ensuring that even the path to peace remains a profitable enterprise. The moral hypocrisy is breathtaking. Those who cry for stability are the very architects of its collapse. And yet, the world remains largely desensitized. The constant flow of information, curated and commodified, dulls the edge of moral outrage. War becomes another spectacle in the global media economy, packaged between advertisements and political commentary. The public is encouraged to empathize selectively, to consume suffering as content, and then move on. The capitalist order does not silence morality, it commercializes it. The language of justice, freedom, and humanity becomes branding for nations and corporations seeking legitimacy while sustaining the very conditions they denounce. The Yemeni airdrop, in this sense, is more than an act of defiance. It is an indictment of a system that normalizes oppression as long as it generates economic stability. It exposes the moral bankruptcy of global capitalism, where power dictates virtue and profit absolves guilt. When morality becomes a market and peace a commodity, the result is a world perpetually on the brink, where every crisis is both a tragedy and a transaction. The reckoning that looms is not just political or economic, it is profoundly ethical. The question facing humanity is no longer who wins or loses these wars, but how long we can sustain a civilization that has learned to make money from the ashes of its own conscience. The Yemeni airdrop and the ensuing confrontation with Israel have reignited a question that has long haunted the international stage. Who ultimately is accountable? The missiles and airstrikes may bear national insignias, but the roots of these conflicts stretch far beyond borders, into the global systems that fund, arm, and sustain them. True accountability cannot be confined to the battlefield. It must extend to the boardrooms, the parliaments, and the media networks that shape and legitimize war. This is the essence of global accountability, to hold not only those who fire the weapons responsible, but also those who manufacture, finance, and justify their use. The time for selective justice has passed. What the world faces now is a moral reckoning that demands courage, honesty, and collective responsibility. The power dynamics that define our world rely on invisibility, on the idea that decisions made in elite circles remain insulated from their human consequences. When Yemen's desperate act of defiance collided with Israel's overwhelming military response, it illuminated a much larger truth. The global community has perfected the art of moral compartmentalization. Nations condemn violence while selling the weapons that enable it. Leaders speak of peace while signing defense deals worth billions. Institutions express concern over humanitarian crises that they indirectly sustain through silence or complicity. The hypocrisy is not new, but it is reaching a breaking point. Every new conflict chips away at the credibility of the international order, exposing a system where the powerful police the powerless, and justice is wielded not as a principle, but as a privilege. Accountability, in its truest sense, requires more than statements. It demands structure. It means dismantling the immunity that shields nations and corporations from the consequences of their actions. It means holding international bodies, including the United Nations and global financial institutions, to a higher standard of transparency and consistency. When some nations can act with impunity while others are sanctioned for survival, the entire notion of global justice becomes hollow. Professor Richard Wolff has long emphasized that without economic accountability, political accountability is an illusion. The same economies that profit from war cannot be trusted to mediate peace. The weapons that destroy homes in Yemen or Gaza are financed through the same global networks that claim to uphold human rights. Until that contradiction is confronted, the cycle of conflict will continue, disguised as diplomacy, but driven by greed. The call for global accountability is not a utopian demand. It is a survival imperative. Humanity cannot endure in a world where might determines morality and profit overrides principle. The Yemeni airdrop, for all its tragedy, has once again reminded us that silence is complicity and neutrality is a form of endorsement. The global public must reclaim its moral agency by questioning the systems that perpetuate suffering in its name. Every government that funds war under the banner of security, every corporation that supplies death under the guise of commerce, and every media outlet that distorts truth for influence must be held to account. The reckoning begins not in courts, but in consciousness, in the realization that accountability is not charity, it is justice delayed too long. The future will not be written by those who justify power, but by those who demand responsibility from it.